What if the ground you trusted most, your street, your school, your church, suddenly let go of you? And what if the only thing that held you in that instant was an unseen hand? Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In tonight's event story, we are gathered around the flame to remember a day the earth itself cried out, and to ask what it revealed about faith, community, and the divine patterns that hold us when everything breaks. Tonight we revisit Haiti, January 12th, 2010, the day the earth shook. Not to retell headlines, but to listen for the quiet mercies and hidden turns that still echo in Haitian hearts. When the buildings fell, did God disappear or draw closer than breath? Stay with me. It was late afternoon in Port-au-Prince. Vendors closing stalls, school children trailing dusty laughter, a sky rinsed in heat. At 4:53 p.m., the earth lurched like an animal shaking free of a net. Walls cracked, streets rippled. Voices rose and vanished. A breath later, silence broke into 1,000 cries. Some called, "Man, man!" Others called, "Bondi Eden, God, help me." We will follow 4 threads tonight, not one hero. A school teacher who refused to abandon her students. A foreign relief worker who landed in chaos and found a grace he didn't expect. A Haitian pastor who lost his church, but not his calling. And a child who survived against odds that should have been final. Their paths cross and uncross like aftershocks, each carrying a secret we won't see coming. In the minutes after the shaking, a dust fog was the first new weather over the city. People coughed and prayed. Phones died. Power blinked out. Where the cathedral had stood, the one whose bells once braided morning with faith, there was ruin and white dust. The National Palace, all green domes and dignity hours earlier, bowed into itself like a man taking a blow. And yet, beneath the slabs and the powder, small lives kept breathing. Who hears a single breath in a city sobbing? But the story doesn't begin and end with loss, not here, not in Haiti. The story begins with calling, and with a teacher's voice that somehow kept singing in the dark. He didn't know it then, but God was already 3 steps ahead. Her name was Marie-Louise Dorsonville, 34, thin as a reed and twice as strong. On Tuesdays, she taught literature, stubbornly insisting that her crowded classroom deserved poems as much as any fancy academy. That afternoon, she had just asked her 7th graders to underline a line about a boat and a distant shore when the floor bucked. "Under the desks!" she shouted. The desks were too small, the room too old. But the children moved. The wall on the courtyard side folded inward, as if it had always wanted to be a door. Marie-Louise felt the ceiling drop, a heavy palm slamming down. She did not scream. She counted. 1, 2, 3, breathe. Dust became night. Chairs clattered somewhere beyond the rubble. Small hands found her skirt, her sleeve, her breath. "Listen to me," she said into the dark. "We are together. We will count. We will pray. We will find the air." She slid her wrist along concrete and found a slit of space near the fallen blackboard. Air kissed her knuckles. "Here," she whispered, guiding the nearest child, Roslyn, to place her mouth into the drift of moving air. They counted, they prayed, they sang, because Haitian children know how to sing when there is nothing else to do. Soft at first, then stronger. C'est pour no que, c'est pour no leve. Believe. Rise. Hours became a new kind of time. Somewhere above, sirens stuttered and went quiet. Somewhere far away, a dog barked at a sky that wouldn't stop shivering. Aftershocks rolled through the ruins like low thunder. A boy whimpered, "Mademoiselle, is my mother outside?" Marie-Louise held his hand and told the oldest truth. "I don't know, petite one, but I know we are not alone." She scraped her knuckles, bloody pulling chalkboard splinters, making the air slit wider. With each scrape, a memory. Her father fixing roofs after storms. A Sunday sermon about faith as small as a seed. A headmistress who had said, Your voice matters, Miss Dorsonville. Use it. She used it now like a lantern, calling the children's names, keeping them awake, keeping hope from falling asleep first. What she didn't know was that, across town, a stranger had just landed, one who would eventually hear her voice through stone. But before strangers, the city had to swallow the night. And before the night, a pastor would walk through dust, looking for the church that was now a memory and a cloud. Would you have left the children to save yourself? Or is there a rope inside the heart that pulls you toward those who call your name? Pastor Etienne Jean-Baptiste kept the keys to his church on a ring he wore around his neck. He had inherited the church and the ring from an old pastor who had said with a smile, "Keys are heavy for a reason." That evening he ran toward the church with the rest of the neighborhood, each person moving like a dreamer, off balance, too awake. The bell tower had cracked open. Pew wood lay like ships piled and split. He found the bell itself on its side, a sleeping giant. He touched it reverently and said, "You will ring again." He did not yet know how. The sanctuary was gone, but the people were there. Hands on shoulders, hands lifting concrete, hands passing the injured down a human river toward the street. He led them to the open patch that used to be the churchyard. "No, ensemble. We are together," he said. "If you can breathe and walk, carry water. If you can pray, then pray. If you can sing, sing quietly, so fear cannot hear its own voice." He began to speak to God the way he always had, not as a far-off judge, but as a father who remembered names better than any registry. "Lord, we don't know what to ask. So first, we say thank you for breath, for hands, for this patch of sky. Then we ask, lead us to those who still wait." A woman tugged his sleeve. "My daughter, her school." He took her hand. "Tell me which one." She named a street. He knew the school. He knew the teacher there by reputation, strict and kind, the kind who fights for every child. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat. "We will go at dawn," he said. "Tonight we keep the fearful from running, the angry from breaking, the tired from sleeping too deep." He found the portable keyboard from the youth choir under a pew and propped it on a crate. The battery light still glowed. He placed a boy's small hands on the keys. "Play what you know." The boy played a hymn that sounded like a lullaby, being careful not to wake anyone. The music threaded the night and tied strangers together. At midnight, an aftershock threw the city against itself again. Pastor Etienne steadied the bell with both hands, as if holding a child still. "We will ring again," he repeated. "We will." When the house of worship is gone, does worship end or begin? And if your bell breaks, what becomes your call to prayer? Thomas Alvarez did not plan to come to Haiti in January 2010. He was an emergency logistics coordinator who was supposed to be on leave, visiting his sister in Miami. But when the alerts flashed, earthquake, catastrophic Port-au-Prince, his phone started buzzing with a different kind of family. Medics, engineers, pilots, pastors, people who don't sleep when they know a neighbor's hurting. He arrived to find a city of dust and open eyes. The airport was a shaking hive of uniforms and questions. Planes circled, aides stacked, hands reached. For a moment he thought, as outsiders sometimes do, that his job was to fix. Then he lifted a drum of water with 2 Haitians and realized his job was first to carry. Thomas had languages the way some people have pockets. He spoke Spanish, English, some French. Creole he learned one kindness at a time. "D'l'eau?" he asked, offering water. "Oui, merci," came the answer, each thank you a thin rope pulling him closer. He was not a believer, not anymore. He had prayed a lot when his mother was sick and stopped when it didn't save her. But Haiti kept handing him scenes that felt like hymns with no words. A grandmother splitting 1 cup of water into 2 bottle caps. A boy fanning stranger with cardboard. A soldier kneeling to fix a cartoon bandage on a toddler's scraped knee. On his second night, Thomas found himself near a collapsed school. A woman at the edge of the crowd, ash gray with dust and grief, gripped his sleeve. "Children," she whispered, Teacher! Still inside. He heard it then, faint as thread through cloth. A voice counting to a rhythm only the living keep. 1, 2, 3, breathe. They brought in a team with rebar cutters and a listening device that looked like a stethoscope for the earth. Thomas, who had learned to make way for specialists, was suddenly unwilling to step back. He wanted to be near that voice. He crouched by the rubble and whispered into the gap they had opened. Hold on. We are here. We hear you. The counting paused, as if the voice were turning toward his. Then, we are 6. 1 is hurt. 6. A number that made the diggers work like men inside a prayer. Hours slid. A aftershock shuddered. A rescuer swore under his breath and crossed himself immediately after. At dawn, they pulled out the first child, blinking and fierce. Then the second, Rosalind, clutching a teacher's hand that refused to let go. Dust streaked Marie-Louise's face like war paint. She looked at Thomas as if she recognized him from a dream. Water, she said calmly. For them first. Thomas gave the children sips. When his hands shook, he told himself it was the fatigue. But later, when he saw the school teacher's scraped wrists, the blood on the chalk dust, he felt something else. A door, he realized, had opened in him where he thought all doors were locked. What if the miracle isn't the building that stands, but the stranger who stays? And what exactly do you call it when a voice in the rubble finds you too? They found Jonas last. He was 9, with eyes too old for 9. He had been under a slab with a triangle of air and a story he would only tell years later in pieces. When Thomas eased him out, the boy covered his face. Too bright, he murmured. There was no electricity, no working lights, yet the morning seemed cruelly luminous. Where's your mama? Thomas asked. Jonas lifted his chin toward the east, toward a neighborhood that now existed mostly in memory. She went to the market, he said, as if markets were planets people might visit and return from with mangoes and milk. A volunteer reached to wipe Jonas's face, and he flinched. Marie-Louise, now on a stretcher with an IV, called softly, Petite moine, it's all right. He came to her side as if he'd been tethered all night. She pressed a small plastic rosary into his palm. For courage, she said. He nodded solemnly, as if courage were something you could actually hold. They put Jonas in the shade of a broken wall. He watched men lift concrete and heard women begin to sing. There is always a song in Haiti, even when the words are made of breath and tremble. He tilted his head and asked Thomas in the grave voice of a small professor, Mister, do you know God? Thomas, who was still learning to say Macy without an accent, blinked. I used to, he said before he could stop himself. Maybe he knows you, Jonas said matter of fact. He knows everyone. Jonas pointed to the slice of pale sky. Last night I counted stars in the daytime. Thomas frowned, then understood. Cracks in the ceiling had made miracles of light in the darkness under the slab. Jonas had named them stars to survive. Counting helps, he added. When you count, you're not alone. Thomas swallowed, thinking of a hospital room years earlier, a morphine drip ticking seconds no one wanted to count. He looked at the boy and decided something without words. I will not leave before this one knows he is seen. Across the yard, Pastor Etienne arrived with a line of church people carrying buckets and bread, faces streaked, voices steady. He spotted the rescued children, the teacher, the man with the foreign eyes. He raised his hand in blessing, then rolled up his sleeves. There was rubble to clear, and prayers to finish, and names to write down before memory misplaced them. And beyond the school, the rest of the city still called. When you can't find the parent who loves you, will you trust the strangers God sends to hold the other end of the rope? And when a child asks if you know God, how will you answer? The first week unfurled like a map without streets. People slept under sheets tied to poles, under stars too bright, and a moon that seemed shameless for shining. Food lines formed and dissolved and formed again. Water came in blue drums, in plastic jugs, in blessings. 100 small miracles stitched the hours. Marie-Louise's students were scattered and lost and found again. She learned to read triage tags and IV drips as if they were new grammar. She insisted on washing the children's faces with water that should have been conserved, whispering, "Dignity is medicine." Her wrists healed slowly, but she ignored pain like she had ignored heat on long afternoons of chalk and patience. Thomas learned the city by smells. Smoke, sweat, diesel. The sharp sweetness of fruit turned urgent. He learned that Creole has 1,000 ways to say we, that no could mean all of us and our little circle right here, depending on the need. He also learned not to say, "I'm sorry," too many times. People were busy surviving, and grief in Haiti is not a performance, but a song you sing while carrying bricks. Pastor Etienne's churchyard became a lighthouse without walls. He set up a table with paper and pens, and wrote names for those who had none left to write them. He organized boys into teams. Water, shelter, quiet. Quiet was the hardest, keeping rumors from running faster than help. He asked God daily for 3 things: wisdom, stamina, and softness of heart. The first 2 arrived. The third kept breaking and being remade. Jonas was transferred to a field hospital. He asked each nurse the same 3 questions. Do you have a mother? Do you have bread? Do you know God? He listened to answers like test results. He did not cry. The night he finally slept, Thomas sat beside him and read aloud from a Creole children's Bible. Someone had pressed into his hands, stumbling over vowels, the story of a storm on a lake where Jesus slept, while his friends panicked. "Puki no pe? Why are you afraid?" Thomas read, and for the first time in years, did not feel mocked by the question. On the 8th day, another strong aftershock rolled through the city, and everyone remembered their bodies are not fixed to the earth by promises. The newly erected field lights swayed. A nurse gripped a pole and laughed, a laugh with tears in it. "We are alive," she said to no one and everyone. "Look at us, alive." If you had to rebuild faith from one plank of wood and 2 hands, where would you start? With bread? With names? With a lullaby that keeps coming back even when you try to forget? 2 weeks after the quake, Thomas visited the school site again. A boy from the choir was cleaning the old keyboard with a t-shirt rag, polishing the broken plastic like an altar. "It still plays," he said proudly, and banged out a tuneless scale. Thomas grinned and applauded as if at Carnegie Hall. He found a letter in the rubble, laminated against humidity, folded into a child's exercise book. It was a note from a mother to her daughter, Rosalind, scolding and loving in equal measure. "Do your homework. Say your prayers. Help Madame d'Orsonville clean at the end of the day. Remember, you are never alone." Thomas held it as if it were a live wire. He asked around, found Rosalind's aunt in a camp not far away, and placed the letter in her hands. She pressed it to her face. "My sister," she whispered. Then, she told Thomas that the market had collapsed. Rosalind listened, silent, and then tucked the note into her shirt like armor. That night, Thomas carried the question to the churchyard, where Pastor Etienne was organizing a distribution. "How do you hold news that crushes a child but might also keep her alive?" Thomas asked. "With others," the pastor said simply, "never alone." He gestured to a group of women who had formed a small circle around Rosalind. They did not say, "It will be all right." They said, "We are here." They reminded Rosalind what her mother had written. "You are never alone." They meant it literally. They meant it spiritually. They meant it as a covenant. Thomas looked at the pastor. "You all are relentless," he said, searching for a word that meant both stubborn and holy. "We have had practice," the pastor said. "Hardship is a poor teacher, but it teaches. We try to learn the right lesson." What would you have done with the letter? Read it? Hide it? Delay the truth? Or would you trust that grief plus presence can become a blessing, even if it feels like a wound? There are rescues that make the news because they seem impossible. Numbers and days and odds that defy the chart. There are other rescues no one counts because they happen in the ordinary hours. A neighbor choosing to share water, a volunteer carrying a grandmother's bucket, a pastor finding the lost by remembering their names. Weeks in, a story moved through the camps like a whispered psalm. a teenage girl found alive far later than anyone thought possible. People passed the news from hand to hand, not to boast, but to bless. Because in a place where numbers are heavy, dead, injured, missing, such a story is a breath, a petition answered in public. Thomas didn't see that rescue, but he saw what it did. Shoulders lifted, eyes cleared. Even the tired smiled. "Late light," Pastor Etienne called it, pointing to the way the sun slipped through a cracked wall at dusk. He had taken to preaching with images because the roofless world now needed pictures more than paragraphs. "When light arrives late," he told the churchyard, "it is not less true. Perhaps it is truer, because it teaches us to wait." Marie-Louise sat on a crate, her students around her like birds on a line. She had started lessons again, if you could call them that, counting games, stories, songs, spelling with a stick and dirt. "Education," she said to Thomas, "is not a building." She looked at Jonas, who had begun to speak more and sleep better, who still asked strangers if they knew God. "It is a way of telling children that tomorrow has a shape." Thomas found himself praying at odd moments, before lifting a box, before saying a name, before deciding which street to take when two were both broken. He didn't call it prayer out loud, but he knew his mother would have smiled. Night fell. The city hummed with small generators and big dreams. Thomas and Pastor Etienne stood at the edge of the churchyard, watching the boy at the keyboard find, finally, a simple melody that did not collapse. "We will ring again," the pastor said, eyes on the moon. "We already are." Do you believe in late light? And if a miracle arrives after hope is supposed to be over, is it any less of a miracle? Or is it exactly the kind that changes you? By the third week, the aftershocks had slowed but never quite left. People began to measure time, not by calendars, but by the number of nights they had slept outside. The city was learning how to stand again, but Pastor Etienne's eyes kept returning to the bell lying in the dust. It was as if his church's heart had been set aside, waiting. A welder from the neighborhood offered to help lift it back into place. "We can make it ring," he promised. But when they hoisted it onto a frame, the sound was wrong, hollow, fractured, as if the quake had lodged itself in the metal. The pastor struck it once, softly, and winced. "Not yet," he said. "A voice must heal before it can call." Thomas overheard and asked, "Why not just replace it?" Etienne smiled faintly. "Because the people who answer to this bell will know it. They will hear the crack and remember. Sometimes the wound belongs in the sound." That night, Marie-Louise sat nearby, marking homework salvaged from the ruins, sheets wrinkled and smudged, but still legible. "The children will need the bell," she said. "They need to know their place still calls them." Jonas, perched on an overturned bucket, offered his own wisdom. "If the bell is broken, maybe God will ring it himself." No one laughed. They simply looked at him as the moonlight turned the cracked bell silver. Would you fix the bell so it sounds new? Or let the crack remind people they survived? Aid was coming in waves, cargo planes, ships, trucks. But in some corners, people whispered about food going missing, supplies disappearing before reaching those who needed them most. It wasn't front-page scandal. It was the kind of quiet wrong that hides behind urgency. Thomas saw it one afternoon at a depot, a stack of boxes loaded into a private van with no markings. The driver avoided his eyes. Thomas's instinct was to shout, but he knew how quickly distrust could tear through a fragile camp. Instead, he followed the van to a walled compound where men unloaded the boxes into storage. Later in the churchyard, he told Pastor Etienne. The pastor sighed. In disaster, the storm is not the only thief. He looked toward the bell. We will not fight this with anger. We will fight it by making sure our neighbors have enough. And they did. Volunteers doubled shifts, shared more widely, kept better records. Marie-Louise found a way to slip extra food to the families she knew were being overlooked. She called it homework. Jonas carried bread in his school bag and handed it to children who pretended they weren't hungry. When Thomas asked why she didn't report the theft to authorities, Marie-Louise said, because sometimes fixing the wrong in front of you is faster than chasing the one behind you. Would you confront the thieves at the cost of time? Or feed the hungry now and leave justice to God? It happened in the most unremarkable way. No music, no announcement. Jonas was playing marbles with two other boys when a woman approached the churchyard, scanning the children like she was searching for a face she had drawn in her heart. Her dress was torn at the hem, her sandals mismatched. Jonas looked up, froze, then ran so fast he knocked over the marble ring. "Manman!" She caught him and held him like she was holding her own lungs. For minutes, they said nothing, just the rhythm of two bodies remembering each other. Then, she pulled back enough to look into his eyes. "You counted, didn't you?" "Yes," he said simply, "and I told them you would come." The whole yard seemed to breathe easier. Pastor Etienne walked away quietly, giving them space. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a thread pulled loose from his own guardedness. That evening, Jonas introduced his mother to everyone, as if she were a miracle he had personally arranged. "This is Thomas," he told her. "He knows God again." Thomas smiled awkwardly, but in his heart, he wondered if it might be true. When the person you prayed for walks into the room, do you thank God first, or the ones who kept you believing? Weeks later, when classes resumed under tarps and in tents, Marie-Louise confided in Thomas. "The day the quake came, I almost didn't go to school. I was sick. My cousin told me to rest." She paused, adjusting a child's posture over a writing exercise. But I felt a nudge, not fear, not duty. Something gentler, like someone saying, "Be where your voice belongs." So I went. She looked at him directly. If I hadn't, those children might have been alone under the rubble. And I would have been safe, but she shook her head. Sometimes safety is not where God wants you. Thomas thought of his canceled leave, of the phone call that pulled him onto the plane. "So you think it was—" "I don't think," she said. "I know." They stood in silence, the tent full of children's laughter. Outside, the bell lay in its frame, cracked but waiting. Would you trade your safety for the chance to save others? And if you felt a nudge you couldn't explain, would you follow it? By late 2010, after the rubble was mostly cleared, a new threat crept in: cholera. It spread quietly at first, through water that looked clean but wasn't. Camps that had survived the quake now fought an invisible enemy. Marie-Louise lost 3 students to the sickness in 1 week. She buried their notebooks under the mango tree where the tent school stood. Pastor Etienne officiated funerals, with prayers that sounded like pleas for the earth to be gentler. Thomas joined sanitation crews, hauling chlorine and teaching hand-washing like it was sacred ritual. He realized that disasters don't end. They change shape. The quake had been an earthquake. Cholera was an erosion. Jonas, now a little taller, asked, "Why does God let one thing happen and then another?" Thomas had no answer that would satisfy a child, or himself, but he said, "Maybe because we can still help. And if we can still help, it's not over." When the storm ends but the rain keeps falling, do you curse the sky or keep building the shelter? It was nearly a year after the quake when the bell finally rang. Not as before, its voice was rough, like an elder telling a story through a cough. But it rang. The neighborhood gathered instinctively, faces turning upward. Pastor Etienne stood beside it, his hand still on the rope. "We ring today," he said, "not because the cracks are gone, but because we are still here." Marie-Louise's students clapped. Jonas covered his ears, grinning. Thomas, who had been scheduled to leave Haiti weeks earlier, stayed just long enough to hear it. When the sound faded, silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of the year's losses, rescues, griefs, mercies, full of God's hand in places they might never understand. When you hear the bell after so long, do you listen for what's missing or what survived in the sound? Years later, Thomas returned to Haiti for the first time. The city had changed, new buildings, paved streets, but the churchyard was still there. The bell hung in its frame, still cracked, still ringing on Sundays. Marie-Louise was headmistress now. Jonas, tall and smiling, was helping repair a school roof. Pastor Etienne, hair grayer but voice steady, greeted Thomas with the same words as before: "We are together." That night, as the sun dipped and fires lit the streets, Thomas thought about all the unseen choices that had led here. Nudges, delays, rescues that came late but not too late. He thought about the letter in Rosalind's shirt, the counting under rubble, the hands passing water. And he wondered, do we ever truly see the map God draws? Or do we only notice it when we look back and see the turns that kept us alive? Thank you for being part of our little fireside circle tonight. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.